everyone. Welcome to our in-house and online audience. My name is Antoinetta Rossi, and I am Politico's cybersecurity reporter here in Brussels. Some of you know me, some of you don't. Welcome. Today I'm here to moderate a panel on defense, digital defense, or as it's better known, cybersecurity. It guards our data, transport networks, hospitals, critical energy infrastructure. Without it, we're lost. Understandably, it's been accelerated in EU policymaking since the war in Ukraine began. But are the EU's defenses really good? And are Europe's key industries responding to the rising cybersecurity threats? With me are three distinguished speakers ready to discuss this topic. First, Ms. Despina Spanau, the head of cabinet for Vice President Margaret Skinas and former director of cybersecurity at DG Connect. Welcome. Secondly, Patrick Pavlak, a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe and former executive officer at the European Union Institute for Security Studies. And last but not least, Mr. Thibaut Meyer, director of the Chief Information Security Office at Google Cloud and former experience at ANSI, French presidency, etc. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, first off, I would like to start with you, Ms. Spanau. Do you think that Europe is up to scratch with its cyber defense?
Well, we've been trying to be for the last 6-7 years. I think we've been trying to build our resilience, our operational capacity, and eventually our defense through an ecosystem of regulatory, legislative, and other measures, also in the international field. So what has Europe done? Europe started long before anybody else in the world did with the protection of its critical infrastructure. You know, people in this room know it as the NIS directive, and we have number 1, number 2. So I think we are unbeatable in terms of the standard of norms we are requiring critical infrastructure, and also the very wide scope of what is considered critical infrastructure in Europe. Because we're not just talking the traditional critical infrastructure operators, so telecoms, energy, transport, healthcare, banking. We've extended it to most important industries for the economy and for the society, requiring then everybody who offers a critical service, an essential service, to meet the highest possible cybersecurity norms and to report incidents. And that is vital. Reporting incidents creates not only knowledge for the authorities, but it creates this public partnership with the private world, which allows you to work against malicious actors, against cyber threats, and which allows you to work in a united fashion with the like-minded across the world. Today in Europe, we are creating a system by which industry speaks with government, if they're operating in Europe, and that allows the government, when they speak in international fora, they try to create alliances with like-minded, because today we need it. We have an actual war happening.
Yeah.
It is right next to us in terms of frontiers, but in the cyberspace, it is around all of us. So if we're going to work against that war, and we already are, I think you have had people from Europol in the last 2 days in your summit, they will tell you what this war is like on a daily basis. We're fending off attacks and hacks every moment, every second. And that is done through cooperation between different actors from the EU and across the world, for those who are like-minded, who want to fight the same enemy. So it's because we have set up these structures, we have our agencies. People do not realize that an agency, for instance, like Europol, on a daily basis, has a center on cybersecurity that is actually doing law enforcement. And it is very much linked also to the war. They're taking down lots of important malicious activity, and they're pursuing the injustice. So
right.
we have an agency working. We have an ESA that is there to advise us and to seek how to build our resilience further and to implement the laws. Very important, big agency now in terms of scope again. And then recently we came up with the European Union Solidarity Act, which is the true cyber defense instrument. This is for the first time that we're talking about how we will fight in cyberspace as an EU. We didn't dare talk about cyber defense until recently, until we came up with a defense union concept, because all our legislation was based on the internal market approach. But this is no longer the case. And now we are at a stage in the EU where we have a true cyber defense. The Solidarity Act, we create anything from EU systems of governments working together in terms of fighting incidents, making post-mortems of incidents to see how we can prevent them, but also bringing people even from the private world to fight against cyber attacks with the creation of cyber rangers, kind of cyber rangers. So this reserve of people who can fend off cyber attacks in case of need. So
Okay.
this is the system, if you like, just some elements of the system.
Great. And what do you think, Patrick? Is Europe ready? I mean,
good afternoon. I think it very much depends on how you measure the readiness. So is our point of reference in time today or yesterday and what we see happening in the networks? And this is what we're preparing for very skillfully, as you said, with institutions, legislation, and so on. Or is our reference point in 10, 15, 20 years where the cybersecurity landscape will look completely differently? And I think the real question here is, if you look at the level of ambition the EU has in terms of digital transformation and the level of ambition we have in terms of cybersecurity, do the two match? Is there a correspondence? So are we preparing also our digital environment for what is coming up in 10 and 15 years? And there I think you can have very different answers. But picking up on what Despina said as well, I think it's all great. And I want to be a bit antagonistic so that we have an interesting panel. So please feel free to disagree with me as well. But I think, despite the fact that we have a lot of those instruments, institutions in place, I think there's a real challenge in, of course, how it all is going to be implemented and what does it all mean, right?
and how they will work together.
Yeah, so when we talk about, for instance, the recent proposals for Cyber Solidarity Act, and it's quite interesting that you present it as a real cyber defense instrument, because I would like to read it still as a sort of a cyber resilience, cyber security sort of framework. Simply because I think many questions that Cyber Solidarity Act will raise, we do not really have answers yet. So if we think, for instance, about privatization of cybersecurity, what is the EU's thinking, or how will the relationships with the private operators will be? I mean, we call them private providers, private trusted providers, but what does that mean? Who defines what the level of trust? How are member states going to work with those providers? I think that's something that is really challenging. One of the provisions there as well, and I think this is the real cyber defense component that you've mentioned, is the application of mutual defense clause. And again, there we have seen in the Council, whether the PSC or corporate ambassadors level, that actually member states do not necessarily agree what an activation of cyber defense, mutual defense clause in the context of a cyber attack would mean. So I think there is a lot of questions to be raised. I think the direction of the travel is the right one, but I think we really have to keep in mind this timestamp and the reference point we want to apply for this conversation.
And Thibaut, you have been in the government, you're now in the industry, and you're hearing a lot about we need to build these private partnerships, private-public partnerships. How is it seen from Google's perspective?
Thank you. Well, definitely we believe that cybersecurity is a team sport and that we have to build this partnership, that no single company, even a global one like Google, not a single country, not a single region even, like EU, can face the rising challenges or the evolving threats alone. Yeah. So we need these deep partnerships and building together our defense. You mentioned I worked at ANSI, but it was 20 years ago. It was even not called ANSI at the time, but a small team. But at that time, we had discussions whether we should trust, and you mentioned that, the private sector to help in the cybersecurity for the public services in France. Hopefully, we are now beyond this discussion.
Do you think we are?
I think
Patrick doesn't agree.
But it also depends where you look within the system, you know. So the part of the EU system where I look, I don't think we have the answers yet. I think it might be slightly different when we talk about internal security, but not, for instance, when we think about external relations.
Yeah, but well, public institutions are working with the private sector to implement measures, to implement controls, to do audits, and so on. And that's helpful. Mm-hmm. So, and I think we should start and really think globally to improve our defense.
But in Europe, the private companies will no longer, actually for a while now, they don't even have the choice within inverted commas not to work with the public institutions. The legislation does that. Yes. Is the way we do things in Europe. This is why I
legislate.
Yes, we do that. Yes.
Yeah.
This is
it's a different form of digital authoritarianism, if you want.
No, I wouldn't call it authoritarianism.
No,
it is the way that 27 countries come together and agree how to have a common set of standards because we have an internal market. It's not authoritarianism, it's actually partnership. So it's like a marriage, you know?
Yes.
So a good marriage. So it's a set of, it's an agreement. But the European legislation actually makes public and private partners work together because this is the only way that you can protect each other. And we saw, for instance, the great example of what happened in Ukraine, where the private stakeholders stepped in immediately, and this is what helped Ukraine build its resilience and preparedness very early in the war and the cyberspace to avoid a catastrophe. It is still a question, how come there hasn't been a major catastrophe? And I think it is because of the preparedness. And if you ask them, it's probably what they will answer to you. And the resilience they built thanks to the stepping up of the private sector that joined immediately and helped them. Yeah. So, you know, one cannot work with the other, and there's no animosity there. It is a common fight. Now, there is a problem of trust, and I see what you mean sometimes. But I think we're overcoming that more and more. The reality has made it so.
Right. But one area where we haven't overcome it is with the cloud certification scheme. And that's currently ongoing. And it's a very, you know, hot discussion, let's say. The part about sovereignty requirements. Some member states feel that it's important to have data, European data, localized in Europe. And yet that means not being able to work with Google Cloud, Amazon Web Services, etc. What do you think about that, Thibaut? I mean, it's obviously something that comes up in your day-to-day. How important, from your perspective, being a French citizen, working for Google Cloud, how important is it to localize data, to protect European data? Is it protection?
First of all, we do believe that sovereignty and security are the two faces of the same coin. So we fully understand that, well, first of all, security is fundamental to any digital sovereignty. And, well, we fully understand that the wishes of the member states to have a control over the data, over the operation, and so on. And, well, the debates are as you said, hot topics. But you know, back in 2019, we framed our vision about sovereignty regarding data sovereignty, operational sovereignty, and also software sovereignty. So how can we leverage, for instance, open source software to make sure that even in a software as a service, you can manage without being locked in with your provider. And I think that what we say, we have to think globally. We cannot achieve resilience while retreating behind national boundaries. Ukraine was mentioned, for instance, at the very first steps, and even before the start of the war, there was this huge move to this global and infrastructure that was far beyond the Ukrainian borders in order to bring resilience. Another example, we deployed in Ukraine our Project Shield solution to protect government websites or NGO websites, journalist websites, because it's quite easy to make a website fall down. It's much more difficult to make a global infrastructure like Google wants to fall down. So, and you mentioned data residency, well, or localization in the, well, we understand these needs, and that's why we now offer kind of a portfolio of solutions.
What do you mean,
like for instance, a EU-based company or EU-based organization,
like Sectum Cloud in France?
Yeah, like to meet the standards, like Sectum Cloud in France, but not only, because there is large numbers of use of this, what we call sovereignty, or C5 in Germany, or the security and sovereign frameworks for the organization to be able to use these solutions.
Despina, how do you see it from the Commission's point of view? I mean, it must be...
You know how we see it. You've written lots of articles about it. So even though the certification scheme has not been adopted yet, when we adopted the certification regulation, we put it in the Cybersecurity Act. So it was not created as a measure for any other purpose than high level of cybersecurity. And the cloud is where everything is kept today. So the whole idea is, in fact, to enable providers of cloud services through the certification scheme, this is why it took us so long, to achieve a high level of trust for the services that they provide. So the way that this scheme is going to be structured is not going to be such as to ban anyone from doing anything. If anything, it is there to enable people to reach the highest level of assurance, if they so wish, so that they can provide their services and offer the trust that is necessary for that. So I think this is our aim. Our aim is to allow everybody to participate. We can't do it without being compliant with European law, WTO obligations, so I think we're not going to do anything illegal. Now, there are certain caveats, which are no different from caveats that you will find for the highest level of assurance schemes in other parts of the world. But these, again, do not ban anyone from entering this certification scheme. You just have to meet the relevant standards. So this is our idea. You have to watch this space because it's going to be adopted rather soon. So because there have been a lot of discussions and in many fora, and it is time. It is time. We can't leave this mandate without having adopted this scheme.
Can you give us a preview of sovereignty requirements in the final?
I don't like the word sovereignty for the requirements. Again, requirements of this on the certification is various levels, on the levels of assurance that one has to meet. And we'll have to see how these are deployed. But again, there will be no intention of banning anyone from providing services.
Maybe just adding flexible requirements. Patrick.
Ideas welcome.
Maybe we should zoom out a bit and talk about something that's been brought up, this dependency on the cloud. So in the case of Ukraine,
yes,
it was very useful, right? As soon as the war began, the Ukrainian government made a very sort of unprecedented step and uploaded all of its data on the cloud. But some people are saying, some insurance companies are saying, it's too risky to have everything on the cloud. Is there another option? And what could that be?
You know that I think when we have this discussion about relationship between public and private sector, what has been also referred to as a partnership and as a marriage, sometimes of convenience, sometimes because of love. I think the problem is that exactly we see this sort of shift in the relationship between the private sector and the regulators increasingly. And the question is, to what extent are the governments really willing to accept those risks? And this risk mitigation strategy is something that we're basically talking most of the time. I mean, in Ukraine, what we have seen is not only moving everything to the cloud, but also dependence on private sector for the provision of the internet and the connection in general, which a few months later actually has proven to be quite complicated when the provider has basically decided that they might actually stop providing the satellite connection, right? So there is this certain dependency that is emerging as well, that I think the governments increasingly need to think of how to address. Now, I do not know what the good solution is. I leave it for Despina and Thibault to sort out with regards to cloud and so on. But I think what we have seen over the past, not even 10, but 15 years, is really this shift in the power balance as well and the nature of the relationship between the private sector and the regulators, which maybe in the US, this adaptation has really progressed much faster than maybe in the EU, but I think that's something that will have to be increasingly addressed. Also in relation to, for instance, civil-military cooperation, right? We have, again, the Cyber Solidarity Act, but we also have the new cyber defense posture that was presented last year that also talks about creating those synergies. And there are many more questions than the answers at the end of the day.
Despina, I'm just going to go back to you because you nodded when I said there's a question of whether everything should be on the cloud. Should it?
Well, I mean, we saw in Ukraine that this saved the day.
Yeah.
So I think that is a choice for the market to make. This is why we need the certification scheme, because it allows operators to also add a certain niche to their services. Because again, it is not mandatory; it is optional. So I don't think it is for the regulator to decide whether everything must be on the cloud. I think the market will decide that. Security will decide that. If those services prove to be more secure, and this is what we're trying to do through the certification scheme, let it be. But I think this will be decided by some. Our duty is to make sure that if this is the case, the standards that are met are of the highest level, because then we really trust a certain type of technology with what is the most valuable for the operation of the society, of the economy, and not only of technology.
Just to move on, and maybe we've been talking about cyber defense, and you said that it was something kind of unthinkable to talk about before, but the other unthinkable is cyber offense, and I feel that there is a little bit more, let's say, whispers about offensive capabilities in Europe, which we just wouldn't have heard about 2 years ago. I mean, to be in a room and speak about a war economy mode now is sort of normality. We have certain, I mean, obviously, national security is a member state priority, but is there a position that Europe can take on this, Patrick?
Well, I think we have already taken certain positions. So we have the cyber defense posture that was presented last year that sort of lays out the EU's position when we think about cyber defense. I think one of the exciting moments around the presentation of the document was Commissioner Breton's talk about, the EU needs to move in the direction of having offensive cyber capabilities like active cyber defense, which got immediately picked up by journalists and observers. What does that really mean, right? He quickly clarified that this is, of course, the national competence of the member states, and the conversation sort of subdued, but we see that this is not something that is, as you said, a taboo anymore. The states are increasingly talking about offensive cyber capabilities. Just to give you an interesting example, when in my previous position at the EU Institute for Security Studies, when we worked on a research paper on cyber defense and wanted to map how many of cyber commands in Europe have offensive cyber operations as part of their mandate, and started with a very limited sort of a circle of the usual suspects, but then consulted the member states to verify the data. Actually, at the end of the day, we ended up with almost every member state in the EU having development of offensive cyber capabilities as the mandate for the cyber commands. So that actually shows you that even though we don't talk about it, it is something that definitely is being discussed at the national level. Now, what is the role potentially of the EU in that conversation, right? Also because we don't necessarily want to be in the situation, even though, as you said, this is still member states' prerogative, where each of them actually develops their own doctrines and goes in a different direction when conducting sub-operations. Because at the end of the day, that has very clear implications for cyber resilience or how the EU actually is going to be responding ultimately. We do not necessarily want country X engaging in offensive cyber operations, which then result in retaliation that all those instruments that the member states collectively will have to address, right?
Yeah.
And I think there is a huge risk there. There again, there's an idea, but for instance, we do not know how the member states collectively, we know individually, but collectively think about, for instance, application of international law in cyberspace. Some of the countries like Romania that talk about offensive cyber operations do not have a position on the application of international law. What does that mean? What are the implications when the military or intelligence agencies start engaging in those operations? For the rest of us, I think it's something really we have to talk about. But it is also the conversation that is increasingly picking up internationally. The US thinking about active cyber defense, for instance, is different than the UK's. UK thinks about active cyber defense purely as strengthening cyber resilience. This conversation right now is also being picked up in Japan, right? The country that normally actually doesn't even talk about defense at all. So I think that is something that we will have to pick up sooner or later and have the position in the conversation, as difficult as it might be.
Thibault, maybe you can take off your Google hat for a second and just put on the French government one. What was it, what was the thinking with member states in terms of defense, offense, how to posture themselves with other EU countries? I mean, France is obviously, very ahead in the game in this field.
Well, yes, France has developed this kind of capacities of offenses, but again, it's a balance to find the investment regarding the defense and now to raise the bar, and also which capacities should we develop and to be able to react.
But if I may jump,
sure.
I think there is also a bigger question when we talk about offensive cyber capabilities, whether it's something really that the EU should be doing. Is offensive cyber the EU's brand, And if we think about one of the questions you sort of floated before the session was, how do we think about the EU's leadership in the domain of cybersecurity more broadly? And frankly, I think there are many things for which other countries will come towards the EU. I do not think that cyber defense understood as in military terms or offensive cyber operations is something where we can build our brand on. And I think that's something that we really have to think about as we engage in that conversation, because, it might be a wishful thinking that if we sort of develop those capabilities and even have certain doctrines, others will come to the EU for this expertise, but I don't necessarily think this is the case. And I think we really have to think about how do we build this leadership position? What are the ingredients of the EU's leadership when we think about cybersecurity? And then how we actually translate it in practice.
Despina?
Let us not forget that the European Union was built for peace. Let us not forget that. But the European Union has evolved into a partnership of countries that are very realistic and that have learned to work together and that grow through crisis. If you take as an example the area of health, where the treaty gives us very little jurisdiction, COVID came, the biggest health crisis ever experienced for the EU, and all of a sudden, health responsibilities came to the hands of the EU, and we were taking decisions as EU, and we were applying decisions as EU. It's the same with defense. Defense has now started with the concept of the EU Defense Union, countries working together to develop similar capacities. But look at what we've done for Ukraine. Who would have thought that we would be discussing amongst member states how to send support, military support, like actual ammunition. And you have a European commissioner going around the world to make sure we have enough capacity to offer to the Ukrainians as we promised. Who would have thought of that? It is going to be the same with cybersecurity. We have built an ecosystem by which countries are working together. We are not at the offensive, but the Solidarity Act builds elements that, if ever are needed, could work together. This cyber shield that we have created, so the ecosystem of the SOCs, as they're called, the Security Operations Centers that will be across Europe, and that will be detecting, they're meant to have public officials with the highest possible technology that will be detecting and issuing warnings and working with each other. So this is cross-border. This can easily serve in case of a big-scale cyber incident, war, or whatever you want to call it, and help with an EU defense mechanism. The same about the reserve. Who would have thought that you could recruit people from the private world and send them to a government to deal with a big cyber incident? This is true defense. Well, now, if this country decides to pass to the offensive, that's a matter of national security, and that we don't have at EU level, and I don't see it happening right now. But if ever, God forbid, we found ourselves in this situation, the EU has built the ecosystem of working together so that we would be able to do this type of defense.
But I think this ecosystem that you're talking about still hinges on the very delicate balance between what member states are willing to give up as a competence to the Commission. And I think here we have a lot of questions that are still unanswered, with regards exactly to the states potentially using this private, trusted private, let's say, operators to assist member states. We see with a lot of crisis response mechanisms, actually, that the member states do not use them, for reason A, B, C, for political considerations, reputational damage that it might have internally. So I agree with you that it's great for the EU to have these tools, but I think we also have to do a lot of work in terms of socializing the member states into using these tools. And I agree that COVID, Ukraine might have created this window of opportunity for the EU to sort of step in. But there is a long way, I think, from the idea to what the member states will be actually willing to give up at the end.
If I may just say something, because you talk about the Commission, what the member states are willing to give up as power of the Commission. I didn't mention the European Commission. I spoke of the EU. And this is the difference of the balance of powers that has been generated by the recent crisis, be that COVID or the war in the Ukraine. We are talking about the European Commission working with heads of state, with governments, and this is really a big game changer in the current mandate. We're not talking about powers of the European Commission anymore. This is now really an ecosystem. You can't do it without the member states. This has to be led by the member states, by the will of the member states. The European Commission is the vehicle, offers the vehicles for it. So again, just to mention, I've been talking about the EU so far and not the European Commission.
Yeah, and obviously for initiatives like the Cyber Solidarity Act and the Cyber Reserve, you're going to have to work with
Absolutely.
industry. And Thibault, maybe you can touch on what Google has been doing in terms of skills and programs, initiatives in cybersecurity in Europe.
Yeah. Well, different things. Well, we are facing the skill shortage in EU, not only. It's a worldwide issue. So we invest in a lot with a certification, training, grants to grow, to raise the bar. For IT and cybersecurity professionals, but not only, also to raise the awareness globally for security. We are partnering with universities. We are developing what we call the Google Safety Engineering Center, the GSEC. So we have one in Dublin for all the content filtering, one in Munich for privacy, and now we are going to launch another one in Malaga dedicated to cybersecurity, and try to also to understand better how the bad actors are working, how do they think, what are the techniques, the tactics, in order to make sure we can tailor our defense and be better prepared.
And in terms of the Cyber Reserve specifically, I know it's still in its kind of infancy, but is that something that Google would be interested in partnering with member states? Was that going to be possible, Despina?
What, for people to join the Cyber Reserve?
For Google specifically?
I mean, how would I know that? This is a matter of the relevant schemes to be met, because the whole idea is that we have proposed, as you know, a possibility to adopt a European certification scheme for trusted services. So I think a lot will depend on those that have this type of certification. There will be a number of criteria that have to be met for people to join this reserve. So it's not by company, it's by competence of the people.
Okay.
It has nothing to do with company. But The question is whether we will have enough people to do that, because you spoke of the skill shortage. Everybody speaks of the skill shortage. As you know, Vice President Skinas and myself, we speak a lot about the Cybersecurity Skills Academy. We're very proud about this project because we wanted to do something very tactile, very tangible to address the skills gap, because we fear there won't be enough people in case of a large-scale incident.
What are the numbers now? Like,
oh, we have reached 300,000 vacancies in Europe. Just in France, I heard the recent number is 80,000, just in France. So I think our number is way outdated because it doesn't take into account NIS2, the upcoming Cybersecurity Resilience Act. So who is going to implement all that? And so there's still jobs to be offered, so there will be a bigger skills gap. So now we are working with partners like Google and others to come forward with pledges that are not all the same, to train people, to certify people, skill, upskill, reskill, whatever may be necessary, so that we can count meaningfully a number of people that can enter the job market of cybersecurity, be that people from the information technology area, but also other disciplines. So this is the idea, because otherwise everything we have been discussing is purely theoretical.
right.
Purely theoretical. And we can be faced by disastrous consequences because we won't have the people. And the other problem we have is that, and I really need to speak out about this because I speak to specialists, that the people who are in the job are leaving the job because of the fatigue, because they're overstretched, because they're burned out, because they're not heard. We have issues that big companies do not include CISOs in their in the boards that make decisions. They do not decide to make the investment. They still make the risk-benefit analysis. Well, how much would it cost me if I'm victim of a cyber attack vis-a-vis making the investment? So we're still at that. There's still a lot to be done.
Patrick, Poland's actually got quite an interesting program there. I spoke with your Minister of Digital Affairs a while back, and he told me that what they're trying to do is match the salaries, or, well, perhaps they can't, but at least, really boost the salaries of cybersecurity workers in the government, so, that they don't get tempted to leave to industry, and maybe have more of a kind of smooth in and out between industry and government and even military.
I think the question is whether you can solve the skills problem with the salaries. I don't think that's don't think that's the solution.
Well, you can retain them, perhaps.
Will the public sector will it ever be able to match the salaries potentially from the private sector? I don't think that is possible. You can sort of bridge this gap a bit and offer additional incentives, and then yes, keep people. I do not follow the skills debate very closely, but one thing that sort of usually comes to my mind when we have this conversation is that actually, rather than just thinking about it, about the whole profession and the community only in terms of financial remuneration, there's also something like the prestige of the position that you're occupying, right? And the problem with people who are working on IT security, cyber security more broadly, is that if you think about where their offices are located within the organization, or how they actually perceived by their colleagues, these are usually people who are somehow relegated in a basement, in a room without a window. I hope this is not the case for many organizations, but for those that I know and am familiar with, this is still the case, right? So this is not really considered as a position that has a similar standing, for instance, to law enforcement officials and agencies. Should we be thinking about elevating sort of the status of people working on cybersecurity in terms of prestige, even giving, creating some sort of a civil servant equivalent, law enforcement equivalent, rather than just think of it as something that's regulated by a market and just one of the jobs? That's maybe the solution that might be a bit more interesting for others, and the mechanism that could work. But I do not have any evidence to back this up, so that's just one theory.
Thibault,
Maybe a few words on that. So I fully agree on what was said. Salary is not the only point, also the culture of the organization, how you value the people, how you trust them. And in this field, public sector maybe can learn some things from from private companies.
In terms of trust, you mean?
Yeah, the trust you put into people, the way you help them through their career, through the goal to grow inside. That's important. And also, I would say, when we're dealing, it's different. Well, it's difficult to hire, it's difficult to train, but as you said, it's even more difficult to retain people. And I think security specialists are passionate people. And if you do not give them a really fun job, a daily task that is,
Stimulating.
Stimulate them, you will not retain them. And so really the goal is also to reduce the toil, to reduce the burden, not make them repetitive tasks, but really put them where they will have a real added value on the process.
And I guess we haven't got any online questions yet from our audience, so please do send your questions along. But Despina, I guess to turn to you, we've got, I don't know, I think 6 cyber legislative acts in the works. I'm trying to keep track. We've got a year left of the Commission. If all of them are adopted before you guys head out, will Europe
Who says
really...
we're heading out?
If
I mean, you might be back.
will Europe really be a leader in cybersecurity? If they're all
Define cybersecurity, because cybersecurity is not cybersecurity technology, and I don't think we're quite there.
And define the leadership, because that's another element.
I think we have been pioneers in the world in building a regulatory ecosystem. That's for sure. And we saw what happened in the US. I'm sorry, I'm tiring everyone repeating this example, but it took the Colonial Pipeline incident for the US to come forward very fast with legislation very similar to, if not equivalent to the NIS, something we had done since 2013, and we had a hard time back then convincing our member states about it, about its utility. But I think we have been pioneers in building an ecosystem and in telling everyone, unless you have a set of standards requiring high cybersecurity norms, you won't be able to deal with this. So I think we continue to do that. The Cybersecurity Resilience Act is another example. So integrating cybersecurity by design in every single connected product that circulates in the world, with the Internet of Things being a reality today. We don't even talk about the Internet of Things anymore. It's the modern world. So the Cyber Resilience Act is about that. And again, we have people coming from Japan, from the US, from across the world, asking us how we did this and how we're going to implement it. So I think there we have a level of preparedness that is unparalleled, topped by the fact that it represents 27 countries together. So I think that this allows us not only to have very high levels of cybersecurity, but also to be able to work with others across the world. The work we are doing with the US, for instance, right now, again, it's unprecedented. We have worked directly on ransomware. We have our agencies agreeing to work and exchange information, and all that even without any formal agreement on security. Not even under the hat of technology. It's just a standalone collaboration because it is necessary. And I think it is because we have this confidence in Europe, which is based on this ecosystem of legislation.
Patrick, any final words?
Yes, no, I think I agree. I think we have all the ingredients to be the leader. You know, we have the political will, which I think is usually the most important component. We have skills. Yes, there might be a skills shortage, but we do have people who know how to do cybersecurity right. We have companies that are active in the cybersecurity sphere that can sort of provide the tools that are needed. We do have unique regulatory sort of a setup and approach when we think about cybersecurity. There was a discussion about de-risking and risk mitigation or risk management. I think the EU's risk management approach is something that actually many countries find very attractive. And we have the biggest tool, which is access to the European markets, which sort of gives us as well this possibility of ensuring that there is a compliance and sort of, let's say, this approximation in the international level as well. I think maybe one of the things, but one that where I think we still need to do some additional work if we want all these solutions to sort of really become the benchmark or sort of a flagship, for the broader international community, is really the investment in what the EU has called last year digital diplomacy. You know, where the idea was that the EU delegations around the world.
I'm just gonna have to cut you short
Yes,
there
sorry.
very quickly.
Yes, so we need to train our diplomats to be more fluent in the digital language, to be able to explain exactly what Despina was talking about to our external audiences.
Thank you. And Thibault, any final?
Very quick word. So yeah, of course, this regulation will bring trust, harmonization also, because as you said, we have to work across 27 countries, but really we have to think globally with deep strategic partnerships, and even outside Europe. A single region cannot be a cybersecurity leader on its own, but really have to work together globally.
Thank you all for this very nice panel, and we'll see how we do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.